Hey, thanks again for joining us. A Russian ultimatum to Ukrainian troops in Mariupol to lay down their weapons has passed. A Marine commander in Ukraine's last stronghold in the southern city, a steelworks plant, says his men might have only a few hours left. Bear in mind, this was just a few hours ago. Ukraine has reached a preliminary agreement with Russia for a humanitarian corridor to evacuate civilians there, but these have failed in the past. However, on plans to evacuate 6,000 people from Mariupol today, following that agreement with Russia, the city's mayor says the evacuation corridors between Mariupol and Zaporizhzhia would be open from 2 o'clock local time.
He said that residents will be able to board buses from the west end of Kuprina Street near Port City Mall, the junction close to the besieged Azovstal plant still, and the main road east out of Mariupol. A former resident of Mariupol says people are nervous about leaving the embattled city because they fear the situation is just as bad in other parts of Ukraine.
Meanwhile, Russia says it has launched its new Sarmat intercontinental ballistic missile. According to President Vladimir Putin, it would provide food for thought for those who try to threaten Russia. It was shown on TV being briefed by the military that the missile had been launched from Plesetsk, the country's northwest, and hit targets on Kamchatka Peninsula and the far east of Russia. Berlin has chosen not to make public all the weapons it sent to support Ukrainian soldiers. According to the Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock, Germany would help Kyiv maintain more advanced weapons systems. It might buy and train soldiers to use them. During a news conference in Riga with her Latvian counterpart, Baerbock said other partners are now supplying armored vehicles and would like to say here and clearly, this is not taboo for us either, even if it sometimes sounds like it in the German debate. We have already agreed to such deliveries, but we do not have anything available at a short notice that we can now deliver really quickly and immediately. When asked about Germany, whether Germany would be sending its Panzerhaubitze 2000 artillery system, which some experts say Ukraine needs to mount a counterattack against Russian forces in the Donbass region, she said Germany will train key soldiers on using and maintaining more advanced systems which it might obtain from other allied countries or buy outright. As she replied, if partners deliver artillery that we can no longer deliver, we will help with training and maintenance. Baerbock also promised a long-term strategy to support Ukraine.
Meanwhile, her counterparts, Latvian Foreign Minister Edgars Rinkēvičs, also at the joint news conference in Riga, revealed that the European Union is preparing new measures to prevent Russia from evading sanctions imposed over the war in Ukraine. Rinkēvičs also said Latvia would be supporting Finland and Sweden in joining NATO. According to him, we're going to be the first to congratulate and support them, and I also hope we will be one of the first countries to also ratify such a decision.
Meanwhile, the Pentagon says Ukraine's partners have provided it additional military aircraft and parts to repair others in Kyiv's arsenal that were damaged or inoperable. According to Pentagon spokesman John Kirby, they've received additional aircraft and parts to help them get more aircraft in the air. He says Washington has not provided aircraft to Kyiv.
Many dozens.
I would just say, without getting into what other nations are providing, that they have received additional platforms and parts to be able to increase their fleet size, their aircraft fleet size. I think I'd leave it at that. No, I mean, I would say we certainly have helped with the transshipment of some additional spare parts that have helped with their aircraft needs, but we have not transported whole aircraft.
Well, we'll be discussing this in a bit, but the Kremlin has accused Ukraine of changing tune during peace talks and slowing the process of that ever happening. The Kremlin accused Ukraine of going back on commitments it made during peace talks and says it was having bad consequences for the negotiations. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said the pace of talks left much to be desired and the ball was in Kyiv's court after Russia handed a document to the Ukrainian side. He said Moscow is waiting for a response, but according to Ukraine's lead negotiator, it's hard to predict when peace talks might resume. In his comments on repeated Israeli offer to host a summit between Russian President Vladimir Putin and Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky, Peskov said there would be need to provide tangible reason for such a meeting to hold. The Kremlin also says a reported ban on Russian players taking part in this year's Wimbledon tennis tournament in Britain would hurt the event itself, given Russia's tennis prowess, and that was unacceptable. President Putin's schedule today, Mr. Peskov says Russian metals companies are facing hostile attitudes from what Moscow calls unfriendly countries, and Russia would come up with a plan to combat this.
Today marks 2 months since the start of the invasion in Ukraine, where about 5 million Ukrainians have fled their homes, cities bombarded, thousands have died. Earlier this week, President Volodymyr Zelensky said about 2,500 to 3,000 Ukrainian troops have been killed so far, and up to 20,000 Russian troops. Moscow has given no updates on its casualties since March 25, when it said over 1,000 had died. Western estimates of Russian losses are many times higher. Ukraine said civilian deaths are impossible to count, estimating at least 20,000 killed in Mariupol alone. There have been on-off negotiations between Ukraine and Russia since the start of the war. Here's a report on 2 months since the invasion.
Russia invaded Ukraine on February the 24th, calling its action a special military operation to demilitarize Ukraine and eradicate what it calls dangerous nationalists backed by an expansionist NATO military alliance. President Putin said as much in a television broadcast at the beginning of the invasion.
The People's Republic of Donbass asked Russia for help. I decided to conduct a special military operation. It aims to protect people who've been bullied and subjected to genocide by the Kyiv regime for 8 years. For that, we will strive to demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine, and will bring to justice those who committed multiple bloody crimes against civilians, including Russian citizens.
The West and Kyiv accused President Vladimir Putin of unprovoked aggression. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg on February the 24th condemned what he called Russia's cold-blooded invasion of Ukraine and announced additional steps to strengthen the alliance's deterrence and defense.
This is a deliberate, cold-blooded and long-planned invasion. Despite its litany of lies, denials and disinformation, the Kremlin's intentions are clear for the world to see. Russia's leaders bear full responsibility for their reckless actions and the lives lost.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on Thursday, February the 24th, called on all citizens who are ready to defend the country from Russian forces to come forward, saying Kyiv would issue weapons to everyone who wants them.
We're already handing out weapons and will hand them out to defend our country to everyone who wants and has the capacity to defend our sovereignty. The future of Ukraine depends on every citizen.
US President Joe Biden hit Russia with a wave of sanctions from February, measures that impede Russia's ability to do business in major currencies, along with sanctions against banks and state-owned enterprises.
The Russian military has begun a brutal assault on the people of Ukraine. Without provocation, without justification, without necessity, this is a premeditated attack.
On February 27th, Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered his military command to put Russia's deterrence forces, a reference to units which include nuclear arms, on high alert, citing aggressive statements by NATO leaders and economic sanctions against Moscow. As Russian forces advanced towards Kiev, they encountered fighting by Ukrainian forces in the town of Bucha. On February the 28th, a bridge was blown up near the town, and it was unclear whether it had been bombed by Russian troops or destroyed by the Ukrainian side. March the 1st, Russian missile attacks hit the center of Ukraine's second-largest city, including a residential area and the regional administration building. The deadly attacks on the city killed at least 10 people and injured 35. A few days later, NATO rejected Ukrainian calls to help it protect its skies from Russian missiles and warplanes, but Europe promised more sanctions to punish Russian President Vladimir Putin.
The only way to actually implement something like a no-fly zone is to send NATO planes into Ukrainian airspace and to shoot down Russian planes, and that could lead to a full-fledged war. In Europe, President Biden has been clear that we are not going to get into a war with Russia.
The next day, Pope Francis said the Ukraine conflict is not a military operation, but a war.
In Ukraine,
rivers of blood and tears are flowing in Ukraine. This is not just a military operation, but a war which sows death, destruction, and misery.
Che semina morte, distruzione e miseria.
NATO warned Russia its war must not escalate beyond Ukraine. And March the 9th, a children's hospital in the besieged port of Mariupol was bombed. The United Nations Secretary General on March the 14th sounded the alarm over Russia, raising the alert level for its nuclear forces after invading Ukraine, describing it a bone-chilling development.
Further escalation of the war, whether by accident or design, threatens all of humanity. Raising the alert of Russian nuclear forces is a bone-chilling development. The prospect of nuclear conflict, once unthinkable, is now back within the realm of possibility.
In the middle of March, the US and Chinese president spoke on a video call about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, warning China against helping Russia. All of this is not without the Russian, Ukrainian, and other delegates negotiating to end the invasion. Since the invasion, President Zelensky has received the Polish Deputy Prime Minister and Prime Ministers of the Czech Republic and Slovenia, EU Commission President, among other leaders, in a show of high-level backing for the Ukrainian president. 2 months since the start of the war, about 5 million Ukrainians have fled their homes, and even though the fight is now in the east, it isn't without cities which have been shattered and the deaths in their thousands.
Our correspondent in Washington, Maria Bird, joins us now. Maria, great to see you, as always. Do we know how big, this new package by President Biden to Ukraine is?
This package is going to be about $800 million. And as of yesterday, they were expecting it to come out by the end of this week. If not, it could take a little bit longer, just depending on the approvals that are needed to sign it. And that would put the aid from the U.S. to Ukraine close to $3 billion. And so this aid package is really going to look at providing more military artillery. This is going to really be trying to strengthen the Ukrainian military and their capacity to be able to fight the war.
Right, and in the weeks immediately following Russia's invasion, Western allies, including the U.S., sought to draw a distinction between defensive and offensive weaponry, preferring to send Ukraine anti-tank missiles and anti-aircraft missiles than to provide more heavy artillery. How different will this package be from the ones that have been sent before by the U.S.?
The package before, as you mentioned, defensive versus offensive. And I think this is really about how do we build or assist Ukraine with building an infrastructure and a military infrastructure that allows them to be able to not just be defending themselves against Russia, but also putting up barriers and putting strategic things in place to ensure that the war can potentially end much sooner. So I think they're really looking at the tactics, they're really looking at the strategic way in which they can support, and some of that is with some of the heavier artillery that they're looking to put in place, and some of, as you mentioned, some of those actual tankers and things that are used in a way of kind of building an offensive military backing.
Maria, clarify for us, because we heard the Pentagon spokesman, John Kirby, saying that Washington had not provided aircraft to Kyiv. So is that the exclusion to this package, for example?
So aircrafts are being considered, and I think that's what is going to, if we see it take a little bit longer than the 36 hours they initially said as of yesterday, then that could be part of it. We know that it's been said in the past that aircrafts and any type of aircrafts that potentially could detonate bombs and things of that nature could potentially create more intensity between Russia and Ukraine. And so that was kind of being refrained from as it related to the U.S. and NATO. But we know that this announcement of the additional $800 million, President Biden made that, or there were allegations or potential alluding to that being the case after a meeting with NATO. And so it's clear that NATO, and including the U.S. and President Biden, are very much in alignment about how they're going to be even more strategic, but even more forceful in the way in which assisting Ukraine in this war efforts.
Another thing to think about is the U.S. government considering how many Ukrainian soldiers are left to fight this war?
Mm-hmm. That's very key. I mean, we know that the U.S. has stated before that they will not be actually putting boots on the ground, meaning U.S. military personnel on the ground, but they will be in obviously bordering countries like Poland. But the real question is, as you stated, if we're seeing a decrease in the number of military personnel in Ukraine, the Ukrainian military, does that then put greater pressure on the U.S. and NATO allies to put boots on the ground? And so I think that this is a strategic move to say that we're going to have to be a little bit more strategic in nature in supporting Ukraine and providing them with additional military resources that could potentially flip what we're seeing today, whereas we're seeing major casualties, especially with the Ukrainian military and obviously with the innocent civilians.
Finally, Maria, in the past few days, we have seen President Vladimir Putin saying Western sanctions have failed, in fact, deteriorating the economy of the West. He contends that the sanctions backfired against the United States and its European allies, and that's because of the measures he put in place to counter those sanctions. How are members of the Congress reacting, as well as American citizens, to the way the economy has turned out as a result of this war?
Well, you can see here in the U.S., there are, we've obviously had interest rate increases to try to settle down the inflation, the hefty rate of inflation that was occurring, trying to stabilize the economy. There are projections that we could see somewhat of a recession. Some of the job boom that we've seen could decrease. But I think that the U.S. was prepared for that. We know that Russia and Ukraine were actually trade partners of the U.S. and obviously other NATO allies. And so trying to, and that has been the discussions even before the sanctions were put in place, as to how that would be redirected and potentially how to still sustain the U.S. economy and obviously other economies across the world as a result of many of the sanctions that were put forth. But at this time, I think the U.S. is prepared to be able to manage forth despite what Russia believes is backfiring on the U.S. And we know that there was going to be a long-term impact on Russia with these sanctions. It was not going to be overnight. So the real question is, in the next 6 to 12 months, what will we see the impact on Russia? And even if the war ends, will that mean that the gates of trade are reopened between Russia, the U.S., and NATO allies?
Well, Maria, thanks again for joining us. We'll be reaching out to you for some more reactions as we've seen this war progressing in a new phase. Well, that will be it on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But coming up on the program, though, Well, the